Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 8th webinar of the series Biodiversity Conversations, India's Opportunities and Challenges. These webinars focus on various aspects of the national mission on biodiversity and human well-being. This webinar series is jointly organized by the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India, the National Biodiversity Authority, and the Biodiversity Collaborative. I'm Ravikant. I'm a senior fellow at ETRI. In the last 2 decades, my research has focused on enhancing the conservation and sustainable use of forest genetic resources. I've also been coordinating the biodiversity and agriculture program of this national mission, which aims at ensuring food and nutritional security by integrating and enhancing the sustainable use of biodiversity. The topic for today's discussion is biodiversity and agriculture. Will the twain ever meet? This webinar will discuss the conceptual advancement in the dilemma between agricultural intensification and the conservation of biodiversity. It will also explore how biodiversity in and around farms can augment food and nutritional security and enhance rural livelihoods, especially in countries such as India. I am delighted that for this webinar, we have a diverse and wonderful set of people who will share their knowledge and experience with us. Before I start introducing with them, I have a few announcements to make. Please open your chat box, as details also will be sent in the chat box. We have already received some questions by email and some additional questions during this webinar. Please use the question and answer facility to ask questions to the panelists. Questions that are not answered during the webinar due to the shortage of time will be answered via email, and you can also get in touch with us at contact@biodiversitycollaborative.org. The email address is also being put in the chat box. Questions can be asked anonymously if that is your preference, but we encourage all of you to include your email ID while sending your questions so that we can respond to you later in case your question hasn't been dealt with during the webinar. This webinar is also being streamed live on Facebook page, Biodiversity Collaborative. A recording of this webinar will also be uploaded soon on our YouTube channel, Biodiversity Collaborative. This channel also has recordings of our previous webinars. Please note that we have updated our YouTube link as we were facing some technical issues earlier this week. We gratefully acknowledge the support we have received from the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India for conducting these webinars. During this webinar, the chat facility will be disabled. Please do not use the raise your hand function. We request you to use only the question and answer function to send your questions. Before we begin the webinar, I would like to take a couple of minutes to give a brief overview of the National Biodiversity Mission in general and the biodiversity and agriculture component in particular. I'll just, The National Mission on Biodiversity and Human Well-being is one of the 9 mission programs launched by the Prime Minister's Office. This mission aims to strengthen the science of restoring and conserving India's natural heritage. This mission has about 7 components. The first component looks at cataloging and mapping life, and it's called Nisarg Bharat. The second component is on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the third component is looking at how climate change and disaster risk management can be averted by biodiversity. The fourth component, which I will talk more in detail, is about biodiversity and agriculture. The fifth component is actually in two subcomponents. One looks at One Health and zoonosis. The second one looks at medicinal plants and health security. The sixth component is on biodiversity and bioeconomy, and the seventh one looks at biodiversity capacity building and outreach. Coming to the fourth component is on the biodiversity in agriculture, and this component aims towards sustainable use of biodiversity in enhancing agricultural productivity, meeting food and nutritional security, and enhancing income of rural livelihoods by incorporating rigorous biodiversity science-based models. So this component of biodiversity, when we talk about biodiversity in agriculture, we are talking at a larger perspective. So when I talk about biodiversity, I talk about, we are dealing with large number of pollinators, which pollinate all our horticultural crops. Almost about 400 crops are pollinated by the pollinators. We also talk about amphibians, reptiles, and birds that help in managing the pests in our agricultural fields as well as horticultural fields. We also talk about the birds and reptiles which manage the rodent population in the agricultural fields as well as in protecting the stored food grains. We also talk about a number of invertebrates, soil invertebrates such as earthworms, the mollusks, the millipedes and centipedes, and number of other invertebrata that help in nutrient recycling, that help in litter decomposition, that help in soil aeration, as well as in nutrient mineralization. We also talk about a large number of soil microbes, including nitrogen fixing bacteria, phosphate solubilizing bacteria, and large number of other microbes, which not only help in nutrient recycling, but also help in making nutrients available to the plants. So when I talk about biodiversity, it encompasses all of these and much more. It also encompasses all the other biodiversity, which helps in meeting the nutritional security as well as meeting the livelihoods of people in and around farms. So, which, and the nutrient could be in terms of protein, it could be in terms of vitamins and minerals, it could encompass everything else. And it also provides nutritional security, especially in times of distress and in times of drought and other natural calamities that take place. So in this component, the problems that we aim to address are looking at how biodiversity can enhance agricultural productivity through many direct and indirect paths, and how no, and in the last few years, how agricultural intensification has reduced biodiversity. And what we want to do in this program is to develop methods to quantify the role of biodiversity in enhancing agricultural productivity and in meeting the food security, though these have not yet been developed. And our major aim is to mainstream the sustainable use of biodiversity in enhancing rural incomes. So this component has been divided into 5 subcomponents, and each of these subcomponents look at various aspects of how biodiversity has helped in increasing agricultural productivity as well as in helped in meeting the livelihood opportunities of people. The first component is on it's a methodology to develop, quantify the contribution of biodiversity in agroecosystems. In this subcomponent, we seek to develop a method which can help in quantifying the role of biodiversity in enhancing agricultural productivity. We also plan to develop estimates of the contribution of biodiversity in meeting food and nutrition security, as well as develop a roadmap for biodiversity-based models for enhancing agricultural productivity. The second component is looking at how biodiversity has directly contributed to agricultural productivity. In this subcomponent, we intend to map biodiversity in and around farms and assess the role of pollinators, the biocontrol agents, the soil microbes, and how these have helped in enhancing agricultural productivity. We also seek to document traditional knowledge and practices and study the influence of biodiversity in and around aquatic ecosystems. So it's not just land, but also aquatic ecosystems that we seek to map. We also plan to develop a roadmap for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity for enhancing agricultural productivity. The third subcomponent is looking at how biodiversity has helped in meeting the food and nutrition security. So in this, we plan to explore the underexploited crop plants in providing food and nutrition security. We will talk more about this in this webinar. We also seek to assess the role of wild edible leafy vegetables, tubers, fruits, and how these have contributed to meeting the food and nutrition security, and how we can domesticate them and how they can be domesticated and used for furthering, or for meeting the nutritional requirements. We also seek to demonstrate the role of microbial, especially mushrooms and other resources such as lichens, ferns, etc., to meet the livelihood and nutritional security. And last, we also seek to assess the contribution of wild animal resources, for example, shellfish, mollusks, insects, fish, and other organisms in meeting nutritional and health, nutritional requirements. The fourth subcomponent looks at conservation diversification of agrobiodiversity. In this, we seek to characterize and conserve genetic resources of, especially of wild relatives of crop plants, land races, and germplasm of important crop plants, and their use in developing improved varieties. And we also seek to characterize and conserve animal and fish genetic resources and explore their use in genetic improvement programs. And finally, we also seek to develop and promote in situ conservation of selected crop species and land races. The final subcomponent is on livelihood opportunities. And in this subcomponent, we try to assess and see how biodiversity can help in augmenting the livelihood of rural households through value addition of bioresources. We like to see how resource enrichment on farms through high value agroforestry tree species can enhance rural livelihoods. And we also seek to promote inland fishery and aquaculture based livelihood opportunities and develop micro, small, and medium scale enterprise platforms on a sustainable basis based on market demand for biodiversity based products. So all these subcomponents are going to be accomplished by a large network of institutions, a large number of networks that are listed here that are spread all over the country. And these include all of ICR institutions, agricultural universities, a number of other central universities and other private universities, as well as a number of research organizations that would be taking part in help in accomplishing this entire mission. The overall outcome of this would be to change the current perception of biodiversity and its contribution to agriculture. Look at how regional and national level policies can incorporate biodiversity-based models in production systems. And with these, we help to conserve the biodiversity in and around farms and also develop methods of novel and unconventional ways by which bioresources could diversify rural livelihood opportunities and thereby enhance rural incomes. So with that brief introduction, I would like to go back to our webinar topic today, which is on biodiversity and agriculture, and will the twain ever meet? So for the first talk would be by Dr. Kuldeep Singh. Dr. Kuldeep Singh is a director of ICR National Bureau of Plant Genetic Resources, New Delhi. After doing his postdoc in Indian International Rice Research Institute, Philippines in the early 90s, he has worked as a molecular genetist and served as director at the School of Agricultural Biotechnology in Punjab Agriculture University, Ludhiana. He was also involved in wild hybridization studies, especially in wheat and rice, using wild relatives and using gene identification, mapping, and using molecular breeding and genome sequencing, and using hybridization techniques to enhance the wheat and rice germplasms. Dr. Kuldeep Singh today will talk on the importance of conservation of agrobiodiversity for ensuring food and nutritional security. We have, along with Dr. Kuldeep Singh, Dr. Ann Dawson and Dr. Manjula Menon. I'll introduce them before their presentations. Now over to you, Dr. Kuldeep Singh. Yeah, you can share your slide.
You're muted, Dr. Kuldeep Singh. Unmute yourself.
Is that okay now?
Yes.
Am I audible now?
Yes.
Good. Okay, good afternoon, and thank you very much, Dr. Ravikant. The title you said is Biodiversity and Agriculture, Will the Twain Ever Meet? I think, in my opinion, they go side by side collectively, and they are interdependent on each other. Okay. I was told that this word agrobiodiversity, although FAO has defined agrobiodiversity very detailed, but we have taken it very simplistic words for us to say agrobiodiversity. It means the components of biological diversity, including their wild forms, which are important for agriculture. And these are either in nature, they're collected, or they're developed. And they're maintained for the purpose of food, fodder, fiber, fuel, health, and nutritional security. So this is how we define agrobiodiversity for our purposes, but in principle, the definition provided by FAO, that's a detailed one. Yeah. And is based on probably ICR has been visionary much before this definition, that we have the 5 bureaus, each one of them responsible for its independent resources, be it plant genetic resources, animal genetic resources, fish genetic resources, the microbial genetic resources, and agriculturally important insects, in fact, all of them. And these are 5 independent institutions of ICR working on specialized form of biodiversity. And I will be talking on agrobiodiversity for food and agriculture. So that means the plant genetic resources. And we have well-defined definition of plant genetic resources, which is in the form of seed, the vegetative propagule, the tissue, cell, pollen, or the DNA molecule. And we do take into consideration that these are functional units of heredity that can be utilized in crop improvement. And in fact, that's the circle or the wall under which we are really working using this definition. And we also understand that out of these 17 SDGs, the genetic resources are directly really responsible for achieving 6 of the 17 sustainable developmental goals, be it zero hunger, no poverty, good health. None of these could be achieved without the genetic resources. And hence, conserving, maintenance, utilization of the genetic resources is pretty important to achieve them. We know agrobiodiversity is very, very important, but we need to really find out the ways to measure it. And one of the indices which has been proposed is the Agrobiodiversity Index. This is in its infancy, but definitely it has 3 important pillars. What are those? These are the diversity in production, diversity in markets and consumption, and diversity in genetic resources. And each one of them contributing to independent issues of areas of health for the human beings. When we say agrobiodiversity, and I told you that when I say here agrobiodiversity, I simply mean here only the plant genetic resources, which are for food and agriculture, nothing beyond, because 10 minutes is not sufficient to really go beyond this one. And hence the diversity has to be in terms of the total crops, and within crops, it has to be the genetic diversity within a species as well. Like you look here in the maize, you have a huge diversity. And unless we have a diversity within the maize fields like this, or we have the diversity of crops like this on the farmers' fields, achieving the food security and the nutritional security may be difficult. And we know the challenge, the human population is the biggest challenge to it. And some of them, for example, what we are more concerned, all the biodiversity people are concerned with the top ones, but we know in agricultural sciences that 75% of the Earth's land is substantially degraded. And that brings the utilization of the genetic resources, their importance more important. The crop diversity, the genetic diversity within a crop, all these are very, very important. We are absolutely, this is a fact for us, but that we will be something near 1.44 billion in 2024, surpassing China, stabilizing somewhere at 1.66 billion, realizing that we need to increase our food productivity by at least 70% in next 30 years or so, if we really want to ensure to feed our population to the level we are feeding them today. But we really need to make one point important, that 40% of our population is still undernourished. And if we include that we have to nourish everyone equally or to the minimum standards, we probably need to double our food production in next 30 years. It's not an easy job. It's a challenge, a major challenge for the agricultural scientists and the policymakers equally. The other thing, which is a major dilemma with the agriculture right now, means from somewhere 7,000 species, which we are using at some time, has gone down to really, we are right now drawing 60% of the calories from three major crops, wheat, rice, and maize. And it has a negative, and this is, for example, in last 60 years, beautiful data. We know how things have changed in the last 60 years, 40 years, when we really had the first green revolution. And this is probably an important one, which I really discuss with our students, that how the reduction in agricultural biodiversity, in crop biodiversity has resulted. Take, for example, Punjab. The farmers are very rich. It's the highest productivity area in the world now, 12 tons per hectare grains, and another 12 tons of the forage or chaff. So making it 24 tons. Still, if you see this from 2006 to 2016, the percentage of the anemic people in Punjab has risen by 15%. Is a question. Why has it happened? And I take a very simple answer that because of the monocropping. 80% of the area in Punjab is under wheat and rice cultivation. So it's all a commercial one. And unless we have a diversity in our plates, we will not have good health as well. That's very, very important. And another thing probably, which is very important for us, this is a paper publication which appeared in last year, Lancet. Have a look on the right-hand side. I think leaving out cereals, our population, our diet is deficit in every other element. Be it vegetables, be it meat, be it eggs, be it nuts, everything is deficit. And that's where the concern is, how to really answer this question, answer this challenge, that how to diversify our crops, our farms, so that our population is well fed nutritionally. And in fact, we are the firm believers that sustainable agriculture and diverse food intake, they are the two key components of agrobiodiversity, and actually where we have to work. And based on this, I will give you some data on how we are actually using. I will skip this one. But what NBPGR is doing is really collecting the genetic resources. We have undertaken more than 2,700 explorations since NBPGR's inception. And even today, 35 to 40 explorations are undertaken every year to collect the genetic resources. And if you see here, our emphasis nowadays is actually, in recent years, 30% of our collections are the wild species. And this is what we really target for next 5 to 10 years. The areas which are very rich in biodiversity for the crop wild relatives, we have mapped these regions, identified these regions, and that's where we like to really stress in next 10 years or so. NBPGR has done well so far when it comes to XC2 conservation. As of today, we are more than 445,000 accessions in our national gene bank. This is all seed gene bank. We are conserving our genetic resources in vitro. We are conserving them in cryo as well. And we have different sort of species types which are being conserved here. It's an ongoing process to tell you. We need to conserve a large number of species in the field gene banks, and this gives you some glimpses of the data, how much we have. And this NBPGR is doing in collaboration with 59 of its site centers, which are across the country. These are state agriculture universities, ICAR institution, some state departments as well, where genetic resources are being conserved into this one. And to tell you that wherever we had information on the longitude and the latitude of these genetic resources, they're all geo-referenced. Anyone interested can really go to this site, which you can see on the left side of this one. As you go to NBPGR page, go to the portal, it will give you geo-reference. For example, you may be seeing different dots. Anybody can really go to the site, click on any of these dots, and it will give you the information, the passport information of that genetic resource, which is available in NBPGR. This is a site where whole information is available. As I told you that NBPGR or ICR per se is quite clear or aware that crop biodiversity has to be there. And we have a responsibility of actually not only conserving genetic resources, but for breeding the crops which are of potential nature. And we are working on 16 such crops. We have a network of 16 universities, ICR institution different, and NBPGR's own institutions, around 40 centers where we are working in a network mode for actually breeding and developing varieties of pseudo-cereals like buckwheat, chinapod, job steer, grain amaranthus, legumes like winged bean, faba bean, adzuki bean, several oilseed and vegetable crops. Some of them are really sort of wild still in this one, and we are working on all of them. Yes, we can say that pretty we are very good when it comes to the conservation of the genetic resources ex situ. But yes, in situ conservation and on-farm conservation are not that strong as it should have been. And that's why in this project, which is a national mission, NBPGR has given all its emphasis for in situ conservation of crop wild relatives and on-farm conservation at farmers' fields for land races, for propagation of the land races and other things. But it's a global issue at the moment, that is utilization of the genetic resources which are already available in the gene banks. There is a data that less than 5% of genetic resources have been used globally. For example, you take the maize land races, you have a huge variability of the land races in the world, a lot of private companies working on development of the hybrids, but the data shows that more than 99% of the genetic resources have not been used. And that's where probably NBPGR has taken a very proactive stand, and we are blessed and in fact highly supported by the DBT at the moment. And we have developed very different procedures and protocols to see how we can utilize the diversity which is in our gene bank for the development of the varieties which are resilient to the climate change, which are nutritious, which could be efficient in fertilizer utilization, the nutrient use, all of them. And we have already this projects going on in 13 different crops, expecting more to add into this kitty. But there we are definitely looking for utilization of the modern technologies like double haploid production that we are not doing at the moment, but using high throughput molecular techniques or genomics techniques to really characterize our genetic resources and phenotyping all our genetic resources under field conditions and the target environments to identify the resources will be resistant to different diseases, drought, and other biotic mistakes. I think that was possible within 10 minutes to tell. And sorry, Ravikant, I have taken some more time, and I will be open for any discussions with all of you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ravikant, you need to unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much, Dr. Kuldeep Singh. That was a wonderful presentation, giving an overall view of the entire NBPGR work. That was really great. And actually, there have been requests for sharing your presentations. So I'll come back to that a little later. Yeah. And now I call upon Dr. Ann Dawson, who is an Associate Fellow, World Forestry, Nairobi in Kenya. He's also a reader in Scotland's Rural College, Edinburgh, UK. Dr. Dawson has been actively promoting the adoption of new and orphan crops to diversify food systems and support human nutrition. Today, Dr. Dawson's talk will be on contributions of biodiversity to the sustainable intensification of food production. I will, yeah.
Good afternoon. welcome to this talk. Thanks to the Biodiversity Collaborative for this opportunity to speak to you on the topic of biodiversity in agriculture and will the twain ever meet? My name's Ian Dawson. I work for the World Agroforestry Centre, which is based in Nairobi, and SIUC, which is based in Edinburgh in the UK. And today I'm going to be talking on this topic, which I hope will be useful for the seminar, on the contributions of biodiversity to the sustainable intensification of food production. This is based on a review on the topic that we conducted last year, and I'm presenting on behalf of this range of authors who were involved. So as mentioned on the last slide, some of us last year were involved in conducting a review on the roles of biodiversity in food production. And on this slide, I'm just going to explain a little bit about the study that we did. And many of us recognize that biodiversity is crucial for food supply. But what we see when we look at the literature, especially agricultural literature, is that those roles are generally under-recognized. So what we did in our study was a review of various meta-analyses and systematic reviews on the topic that are available in the literature. What we wanted to do was to understand better the roles that biodiversity does have and is recognized to have in food supply, food production. What are the trends that affect food production that relate to biodiversity and therefore affect the future role that biodiversity can have in terms of implementing more biodiverse food production options. The reason why we were conducting this review was we were asked to do so by FAO to support the production last year of the State of the World's Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture. And this slide just shows the cover of the final State of the World's Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture 2019 and is available from this hyperlink that's shown here. Now, the report itself was based on a number of sources, but two main sources were thematic studies, of which our study that I'm describing here was one, and a number of country reports. Now, I think there were over 90 country reports, if I remember rightly, one of which was India, and I think 9 in total came from Asia. So this slide just summarizes, again, what we wanted to do in our review. These are the different interactions that we wish to explore. They included things like interactions between livestock and crops, involving trees, involving soil microorganisms, and involving animal pollinators. So this slide just summarizes some of our findings of our review. The schematic illustrates this. So on the left, we have the different components of biodiversity that we were exploring in the review. What we find is that interactions between those different components are often positive. They have beneficial effects for food production. But this isn't the case always, obviously, and sometimes the interactions can be negative, which is an important point. Also, looking at the literature, we were able to identify what we think are the main trends affecting food production that relate to biodiversity. These include things like the homogenization, sometimes called the westernization of food systems, and the homogenization of production of food, as well as the consumption, and also issues like human population growth and increased incomes which support more meat consumption. After that, we moved on to look at what biodiversity options could be implemented to support food production, and we looked at this in terms of research options and also in terms of options for adoption of more biodiverse practices and I'll come back to that in a later slide. And just to summarize, what we find is that biodiversity's beneficial roles for production are better quantified for certain components of production than they are for others. So for example, if we take the case of trees, we find that the role of trees in providing pollinator and more pollinator habitat are well established in terms of how that has a positive impact for food production, and also the role of leguminous trees in supporting symbiotic nitrogen fixation and transfer of that nitrogen to crops are also well established. And in other areas, of course, we actually know much less about the role of biodiversity in supporting the food supply for various reasons in terms of the design of the studies that have been undertaken to try to work out that role, or just simply because it's much harder to work it out. So to summarize some of our findings, and this is no surprise, but what we find in the literature is that biodiversity's roles in supporting food production are often, not always, but are often very context specific. What this means is that there are often high transaction costs associated with practical adoption that are associated with knowledge acquisition by farmers, and that can be a problem. And what that means is that good extension systems that are able to build that knowledge with farming communities are really important for obtaining wide-scale adoption, scaling of practices. And so really that's an important take-home message, that having good extension systems in place is really important for the adoption of biodiversity-related practices in agriculture. So just to explain a little bit further what we did in our review, and that was for each of the components of biodiversity production systems that we were looking at, we tried to give examples of interventions that could be used to further support food production, how we might measure the efficacy of that intervention, and also what some of the remaining knowledge gaps are where research is needed. And this is just an example from the review in the case of trees, where we explore each of those issues in this table. And this is just another example of the same thing, but in this case for animal crop pollinators. And just to give you a few examples of the interventions that can be used here to further support food production, it would be things like reintroducing pollinators into landscape, protecting natural habitat, further planting of trees, jointly managing wild and introduced pollinators in landscapes, and reducing insecticide and herbicide use. So one of the things that might be useful for India is to think about the approach that we used in our review and apply that to the literature that's available specifically for India, to look at how the situation could move forward in terms of introducing, supporting, reintroducing biodiversity into Indian food production systems. And for those who are interested in exploring a bit more about what we did, you can find the thematic study for FAO at this hyperlink that's given here, or there's a scientific paper on the work that we did published in the journal Global Food Security last year. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dawson. That was a nice presentation. And now I request Dr. Manjula Menon to give a talk on-farm bioresources and livelihoods. Dr. Manjula Menon is a faculty at the School of Development, Ajim Premji University. Till recently, she was with MSSRF as a principal scientist. She has been actively involved in assessing the contributions of biodiversity and the socio-economic benefits in agricultural economy. Over to you, Dr. Manjula.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi.
Yeah.
I'll start sharing my screen.
Yeah.
Is my screen visible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ravi. And I'll be talking on-farm bioresources and livelihoods. I'll put a caveat here. This is not based on any of the original studies that I have done in terms of assessing, biodiversity values, but this is a collation of materials from secondary sources. So as has been mentioned by my previous panelists, the on-farm bioresources consist of the plant-based genetic resources and the non-plant-based genetic resources like cultivated crops, harvested and managed wild plants for food and medicine, and trees on farms. And then the animal species ranges from the microorganisms like rhizobia fungi, earthworms, and then the pollinators, predators, pests, and the larger level, higher animals. And another important aspect of the on-farm bioresources is the local or traditional knowledge, because since it is an agro-biodiversity, agro-ecosystem, human activity of agriculture is an integral part of the on-farm resources, because it is this human activity of agriculture that determines the conservation of on-farm biodiversity. And these on-farm bioresources play a major role and function in sustaining the production of food, fuel, and feed, and it's a source of wild greens, tubers, and medicinal plants. And it serves as a building block for new variety developments. All these are things which has been articulated by my previous panelists. And it provides a host of ecosystem services, and it provides biological support to production through soil fertility management, pest and disease management through the pollinator, pest and predators, and pollination. And in a nutshell, all these roles and functions enables this on-farm bioresources, makes this bioresources to contribute to the livelihood of a wide range of stakeholders. Recognizing the importance of these bioresources in ensuring sustainable food and livelihood security and in reducing poverty, many of the international development organizations have enlisted agriculture biodiversity as a means and pathway for achieving sustainable livelihood. This is one of those DFID frameworks, sustainable livelihood framework, where the agriculture biodiversity are represented as the capitals or the assets, which the stakeholders use to design livelihood strategies to achieve the livelihood outcomes. So who are the stakeholders? And there's a wide range of stakeholders who depend on this bioresources for their production and livelihoods. On the bottom end of the spectrum is the farmers and the rural community. Farmers of all kinds practicing traditional system of agriculture or modern system of agriculture, and the rural community which depend on it as providers and users of traditional medicine and food. What is the main concern of these stakeholders on the on-farm biodiversity is that they look at it as a source of sustaining their production and livelihoods. And for the traditional medicine and for those who are providers and users of traditional medicine and food, they look at it as source for having access and use rights on certain roots, wild plants, extracts, which have high medicinal values. And on the other end of the spectrum are stakeholders with the high level of operation. For example, the multinational companies whose main concern on the on-farm bioresources is profit making through exploitation of these bioresources for commercial purposes. And what their main concern is to have continued access to this in situ on-farm biodiversity. And you have these international gene banks who also have who prioritize access and exchange to on-farm genetic resources as their primary concern with relation to the on-farm resources. And you have this public and private sector R&D who works on, who also accesses this on-farm resources, and they also prefer to have open access and freedom of exchange of these on-farm resources. And they also like to capture financial rewards through this patent by using patents or having this intellectual property rights. So then, so we have seen that on-farm bioresources play an integral role in the lives and livelihoods of the rural community, and also they have huge commercial and research interest, research values. So that brings us to the fundamental question that the webinar is trying to raise, whether biodiversity and agriculture can coexist or can coexist. So there is a traditional thinking that there is a trade-off between development and conservation. So when you look at it from a biodiversity perspective, there are three aspects that you have to look at: protection, sustainable use, and conversion. In any other kind of ecosystem, these three are mutually exclusive. But when it comes to on-farm bioresources, because it is managed on a private property, which is an agriculture ecosystem, and the distinctive feature of the on-farm diversity is that human interference, whereas I have already mentioned that the human activity on agriculture is what is fundamental to sustaining the on-farm resources. So here, sustainable use doesn't lead to conversion or loss of this biodiversity, but sustainable use and consumption is a means of conserving this biodiversity. So we can see that farmers, irrespective of the level of intensification that they might be having on their fields, will manage a minimum portfolio of plant and non-plant based genetic resources. And there are also other macro factors which are working, which are providing an enabling environment for conserving this on-farm resources. One is the phasing out of the subsidies to external input-based agriculture, wherein, agriculture is more and more trying to depend on the bioresource-based plant protection measures and for maintaining soil fertility. And globally, there is an increasing demand for ecologically friendly agriculture production processes and products. And there is a huge recognition for cultural values and traditional knowledge on farm-based resources, which is recognized by the conventions, international conventions on biodiversity. But that doesn't mean to say that everything is like hunky-dory and everything will get conserved and and there is not going to be any trade-off. We have seen that there are different level stakeholders who have different interests on using this on-farm resources and different concerns on how to use these resources. So, and these resources are privately owned because it's on-farm, it's on private agricultural properties. And you can see that the stakeholders are at different ends of the power hierarchies. There is a lot of power hierarchy among the stakeholders, and there is a market which leads to market imperfections. So there is a competition between the resource use between these stakeholders. So there is a competition in use of on-farm bioresources between those who want to use it for sustainable livelihoods versus those who want to control access of these resources for commercial extraction. And in the context of this power hierarchies among stakeholders and then imperfect asymmetry in market information that leads to market imperfections and ultimately to overexploitation of these resources and erosion of on-farm resources. That brings us to that opens up an opportunity also, because this the conflicting use of this bioresources between sustainable production and livelihoods and commercial exploitation, and in the unequal power structure opens up potential for capturing economic rent from the use of agrobiodiversity. So what do you mean by the economic rent? It is a profit from the commercial use value of this diversity. It's the surplus value that these multinationals and other private R&D firms make out of using these bioresources and use of these bioresources in bioprospecting and biotechnology and producing GMO crops. So the argument is that the local community who use bioresources for subsistence have a right over the surplus value generated through the commercial use, because it is this local community that is also protecting, conserving, and providing these bioresources for use to this large multinationals and for commercial interests. So the market asymmetry that exists now, because of the market asymmetry that exists now, the market price of the bioresource at the collection point is not enough to understand the real value of the bioresources. So the market price is only an arbitrary value. So if you really want to accrue a portion of the surplus value to the conservers and providers of this bioresources, we need to really understand what is the real value of the bioresources that gets into this commercial productions. That brings us to the relevance of economic valuation. And to understand this actual surplus value that has to go to the community requires appropriate estimation of the economic value of the bioresources. And this can be done only if there is a clear clarity and clear scientific understanding of these bioresources across the value chain. What is the value addition that happens across the steps, and what is the contribution of the raw material or the bioresources to the value of the final product that comes through the commercial exploitation is something which we need to understand, and then has to be estimated using a value chain analysis. And the choices and trade-offs that a primary producer or a primary conserver of bioresources will make, whether to conserve these on-farm resources or to overexploit it, will depend on the kind of benefit sharing mechanism that we can work out and the resulting incentive structure that will help facilitate flow of a bit of the surplus value, a proportion of the surplus value back to the providers of these bioresources. And the real value of the bioresources should be reflective of the contribution of the bioresource to the total product value, which means the total final commercial product that comes out of this use of these bioresources, plus the profit that the companies or the R&D firms make, plus the relevant rent of the bioresource. What do you mean by the relevant rent? Because these bioresources might have different levels of scarcity and endemicity. So if this resources that is in high demand by the commercial enterprises are scarce in the area of production, then you have to put a scarcity rent to it, which is based on the limited stock of bioresources versus the higher demand. And an endemic rent can be applied to those bioresources that are limited to a geographic region and which has a huge commercial potential and that is being extracted by these commercial firms. And an information rent can be paid to those bioresources which by itself cannot be used in a commercial production unless it is accompanied by the traditional knowledge held by the community in use of these resources. So it's not only the resource that goes for commercial exploitation, and also the ITK, or the traditional knowledge which is held by the community, which is also being extracted. So information rent, in the case of those kind of bioresources, has also to be reflected in the real value to arrive at the real value of the bioresource. And it's just giving a preview of the kind of international agreements governing bioresources. It's not exhaustive. I've only put the major kind of international agreements and the corresponding specific in the legislations that address this. And you can see that most of them talk about sustainable use, conservation, and access and benefit sharing as a third principle. And this third principle of access and benefit sharing is found to be a prerequisite or a fundamental to ensure sustainable use and conservation of these resources.
Yeah, I think.
Again, talking.
Yeah, you can.
Am I running out of time?
Yes. Yeah, you can just conclude.
I can just finish with this. Yeah. So this access and benefit sharing mechanism, is a means of revenue generation for managing the biodiversity, and this also can be an incentive mechanism for incentivizing the conservation and sustainable use. Here, what we are measuring is the direct use value of the bioresource, which has market and business potential, and this is a mechanism to help correct the market asymmetry information value of final product. And there are several methods which are propounded to arrive at this estimation of how much of benefit sharing to be done. So if it is a cultivated bioresources, it's a cost of production or cultivation method, and there is a maximum willingness to pay method, which means to say because the stakeholders across the value chain really doesn't know the value of the final product. It's a user who knows the real value of the product, so a commercial exploiter. So the maximum willingness to pay by the commercial exploiter at the point of collection is also a proxy, and minimum willingness to access. These are all different methodologies which arrive at access and benefit sharing. I won't go into the details of that. And another method is, one is like incentivizing the community who conserves and provides its bioresources. And the second is to promote on-farm bioresource-based social enterprises, wherein the rural communities who are conserving these resources can come together and develop a value chain and can have a value chain approach to developing this into products which are commercial products which come out of it. The FPOs and other collectors can play a huge role in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Manjula. What I will do now is there are a lot of questions that are coming in, but I don't think we can answer all of them. But I have selected few questions, and then maybe those we can answer live, and others we can send it by email, respond to them by email. So I have few questions for Dr. Dawson. One is from Dr. Mamta Girish, who wants to know how biodiversity can enhance agriculture efficiency, and can biodiversity and intensified agriculture coexist?
So can biodiversity and intensive agriculture exist?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. It's obviously a great question. The study that I mentioned, we were looking at how biodiversity impacts on productivity of food production, and of course that shows that biodiversity can have a positive role in overall production and sustainability of production as well. But I think perhaps, as Dr. Manjula in particular was talking about, there are many other issues that need to be considered as well. And it's not so much productivity which is key, but often profitability. And there are cultural and social factors that also need to be considered. So there are options, but there are many challenges as well. And yeah, basically that would be my answer.
Yeah, okay. And this is a general question by Dr. Raghu. He's asking, what is the role of farming community in addressing or enhancing biodiversity in agriculture? Dr. Kuldeep, would you like to answer that? How biodiversity can be, the farming community can address or enhance biodiversity in agriculture?
I think no one else can do it better than the farmers can do it. Simple answer. Okay. It's for the farmers. See, we know that agriculture is moving more towards commercialization as well. But we are also aware of the fact that average holding size is very small here. And for farmers, in fact, what will be more important if they have the good marketing linkage for their produce, then farmers can grow everything they want on their farms. And you have several, for example, if you compare the states like Punjab, Haryana vis-a-vis even Karnataka, or you go to any of the Northeast states, there's a huge difference between the two states. I mean, two groups of the states here. Farmers, and here we say not only the plant biodiversity, agrobiodiversity. See, 30 years back or 40 years back, every household in India used to have the cow, the hens, the fish, and it was an integrated farming. And in so-called advanced states like this Punjab and Haryana, the integrated farming has almost vanished. So if farmers do not maintain this biodiversity, believe me, no one else can do it. The government organizations cannot do it. We can have, okay, as ex-situ gene conservation, we had ex-situ collections, or maybe we can think of few gene sanctuaries, maybe few hectares here and few hectares there. That's not going to answer. It's only farmers who can maintain the biodiversity on farms.
Yes, true. And there's one more question related to that.
Can I come in?
Yeah, yes, Manjula, please go ahead.
Yeah, I completely agree with Dr. Kuldeep, but at the same time, putting the whole onus on a smallholder to conserve biodiversity for the social benefit is too much, because why is people moving towards more monocropping and intensification is because there is a trade-off between the ecology and economy. So there should be some mechanism which will compensate for this kind of private cost that the farmer bears on providing this social benefit. So that's where the whole access and benefit sharing mechanism or other kind of payment for ecosystem service kind of monetary financial instruments which has to come in, so that it encourages or incentivizes farmers to conserve biodiversity for the larger social benefit.
Yeah, that's a related question, but it is in another sense. So Ms. Kezia is asking, what level of threat does large-scale industrial farming pose to Indian biodiversity and ecological integrity, and how widespread is it presently? Yeah, Dr. Kuldeep, you'll have to take on that.
Well, definitely large-scale farming, they will always go for monoculture because it will be primarily mechanized where multi-cropping systems are not going hand in hand. Definitely, and you have the Western world as an example there, but you have some good examples within the country as well. For example, one good example which I found was in Maharashtra. You have an intercropping between soybean and the pigeon pea. A very good system. You have 6 rows of soybean followed by 2 rows of pigeon pea. So that if one crop fails, the farmer gets advantage of the other. And second, that these two crops are at different heights. They do not compete with each other. And both of them go mechanized as well because they plant 6 rows of soybean that's planted mechanically, that is harvested mechanically. And another example which I tell you is probably a sort of somewhere in one of the ICR institutes doing in the Northeast, Assam. The farmers are small scale and a good number of them have started planting potato. For each one of them, going for commercial plantation was not feasible. But what is a simple procedure of pooling the land, and is the plantation other things going on through machinery, and each farmer paying for the land, they are actually involved into it. So that goes a second form of large scale planting. And here definitely the monoculture is there. It cannot be feasible for 5 crops, 10 crops to go together. And coming to the second part of the question, unfortunately, bearing a few states, you still have a lot of crop biodiversity on the farm. It's true.
Yes. Okay. This is a question to Dr. Kuldeep as well as to Manjula. It is clear that diversity of food and even food sources are on a decline due to interconnected markets and increasing subsidies promoting cash crops. How will we sustain efforts to balance income security of farmers with diverse food production systems to stop the so-called hollowing of farmland villages due to outmigration of the younger population?
Maybe I will leave this question to Manjula to answer first. She has a good expertise in this one. It's a tough one.
Yeah. I think Ravi, could you please, recap the question once more because
This is from Dr. Radhika, Ms. Radhika Gupta, which she's asking. It is clear that diversity of food and even food sources is on a decline due to interconnected markets and increasing subsidies promoting cash crops. How will we sustain efforts to balance income security of farmers with diverse crop food production systems? So how do we balance between food production systems and income security of farmers?
Correct. So that brings us again to why should a small subsistence farmer continue to be doing subsistence farming with so much of diversity when it doesn't give them a proper economic return? So if we want this to continue, there should be some kind of subsidy mechanism which is not so much chemical input based, but more on the ecological conservation based, or something like a good agriculture practice based payment mechanism or subsidy mechanism which has to compensate for this.
Okay. And Dr. Sunil Nautwal is asking what effective measures.
Ravikant, I will
connected, so I thought I'll pull it together.
Yeah, I would like to add a little more to what Manjula is saying. Probably there may be a difference of opinion. See, for small holding farmers, maintaining biodiversity on their farms is in their favor, not against them. Why I'm saying this? A bigger farmer, larger farmer can really afford selling one crop in a year. For example, if he or she goes for mango cultivation or quinoa cultivation or any other fruit which gives once a year, or maybe major crops like wheat and rice, which gives you income twice a year or so. But if you have a smaller farmer, even a small holding, and they planted different crops on weekly or 15-day or 1 month crop interval, there are beautiful models which universities have developed that can give them subsistence, the continuous income around the year, rather than getting this income once or twice a year and falling to the nets of these money lenders. Those models also need to be really looked into, and personally, I would feel that the small farmers need to be encouraged to adopt that. And going for integrated farming will really help them more than it can help to the large scale farmers.
True. Yeah. And yeah, Sunil Nautiyal also is asking how effective measures can be taken for conservation of agrobiodiversity. And he feels that not respecting local foods in our country is responsible for a drastic erosion of biodiversity. And he feels that food from one part of the country is dominating all over, which is responsible for eradication of local crops and land races. You have any comment? It's also a comment, also a question. You have anything to add, Dr. Kuldeep?
Well, I don't see here. See, probably you need to blame few other things. The whole world is a single village now.
Yeah.
Right? 40 years back, if there was some development in the West, it will come to us after 20 years or so. But now, before it's launched in any advanced market, it reaches everyone. So that's one thing, and it's true for the food as well. But at the same time, I tell you one thing, probably some youngsters who want to adopt farming, they need to adopt some innovative procedures as well for selling this produce. It may not be feasible for an individual smallholder to do it, but if they make some sort of networks which they can really develop their own foods and sell into cities in a different way. I can give you some examples, and things are moving like that. See, Jaggery, for example, Jaggery is a crude form of the sugar cane. That's a very important food item in the country. In some time of the last, I think about 5 to 10 years time in between, this was already vanishing until the people have started developing, these youngsters have started developing different procedures, sending it back to the cities, well packed and in good sizes. For example, earlier there used to be a unit will be 5 kg or so, and a 5 kg unit nobody will buy now. But they're making it smaller units, let's say 50 grams, 20 grams or something, beautifully packed. And it is being used. Use is actually much more enhanced than it was with our elders earlier, let's say 20 years or 30 years back. So those sort of innovative ideas, the young farmers really have to develop. Pack it, send it to the bigger cities, collectively, not as individually. Because individually, the produce is not that much that they can really benefit out of it. So making smaller groups with a simple collaborations, one of them can buy it, a few of them buy it, sell into the market. That's an approach probably that could be adopted by the youngsters.
Yes. This question is...
Ravi, can I come in for a...
Yes, Manju.
I would like to add on to what Dr. Kuldeep was saying, and also as an response to what Jonah has raised. See, when you talk about smallholders and the local foods and they losing out on the market, I think we should draw from what is happening with the millets, which was hitherto called as an underutilized horse grain. And there is a niche market developing for it. And what is happening across countries, like collectivization of millet growing farmers and the value chain development, and large number of civil society organizations play a nurturing role and build the capacities of these farmers to play the role of an entrepreneurs and promote agribusiness based on these local foods. And that would also be a method of giving them that bargaining power, just like how Dr. Kuldeep has rightly pointed out, individually they will lose out because they don't have a voice and there is power structures in the market, and they lose out on price discovery. But then they come together, and the FPO, the promotion, the policy of the government of India to promote FPOs can also be, sourced into. And you have collectivization of farmers who grow these local foods, value addition, promotion of agribusiness will give them some kind of a platform to get economies of scale and have that kind of bargaining capacity.
Yes, yes. Yeah. Dr. Dawson, Dr. Kanchan Chopra is asking, you rightly said that transaction costs of adoption are high. What interventions would your research suggest for decreasing these? There are a lot of similar questions, so I thought I'll ask that as the main question.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's a difficult situation, but at least in our research, we would try to focus on what we would call building blocks that are more widely applicable, so that can be applied across a range of contexts. And so one of the approaches that we've developed is something called the food crop portfolio tool, which can be used in different settings by rural communities to decide for themselves what are the nutrition gaps that they face and what crops they could grow to fill those gaps. And so in that case, we developed this thing called the food crop portfolio tool. And the idea would be that it can be used in many different contexts. It doesn't need to be for a specific context. In fact, we've used it in, I think, 16 different locations so far, and it performs reasonably well across those locations. So you're looking for those kind of building blocks which provide methods which can be used across different contexts, but it's not easy.
Yeah. Okay. Manjula, there's one question by Sumit Roy who is asking who will be paying for smallholders for the payment of ecosystem services.
Yeah, so for payment of, as rightly pointed out, payment of ecosystem services need clear identification of the providers and the beneficiaries. But in this case, it's not possible. So the government should step in. Like, it can be some kind of green box subsidies, like for adopting a certain kind of farming system, or it can be some kind of an environmental cess or something like that, either in the form of taxing the consumer or paying a subsidy or an incentive to the producer. This is because, as in any other kind of payment systems, you cannot clearly identify the beneficiaries and the providers.
Yeah. Okay. And this question from Nalini Mohan: what is the level of understanding and contribution to conservation by local people in villages? What is the level of understanding of biodiversity with respect to how biodiversity has been contributed, and would local people conserve biodiversity? Has any study been conducted on that level? What is the level?
I could just comment for the region that I know, which is Africa, but in our case, World Agroforestry, we've done many studies of village inventories of diversity, so that's shown in those cases the role of local communities in conservation, and I guess very much it must be the same in India as well, I guess.
Yes, Dr. Kuldeep, you want to comment on that?
Well, I would like that this question should be posed to an NBA to quantify it. I would say yes. The local farming communities are very well averse, are very well familiar with the importance of the biodiversity. They know how to conserve it. And we have those village level biosafety, biodiversity committees and other things. But whether it has been done a well study, some detailed study has been done or not, probably NBA could be asked about this question.
Yeah, I would like to comment here that one of the objectives of the National Biodiversity Mission on Agriculture is also to quantify, what is the level of understanding of biodiversity, and how people in local villages perceive biodiversity and how they think that biodiversity has contributed to their agricultural productivity. So that is actually a part of this mission that we would also be looking at. So I would
see, it's very, very simple. I think while sitting in cities, we are thinking slightly differently.
Yeah.
Go to a farmer never kills a snake.
Yes.
No farmer kills a snake.
Yeah.
They know it, right? No
Yes.
farmer kills the birds. They really try to ward off them, but they don't kill them. They're familiar with they actually know the importance of those ones. The farmers know they really keep on migrating the honeybees as well. It's not one thing that the honeybee farmers, they may be looking for more honey production, but at the same time, they take it to the places where the farmers are benefited as well. So they're fully aware of those things. The only thing is to quantify it and bring it to the written form. I'm sure there must be some, but I'm not aware of that one at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, I think we are running out of time, but I'll ask one more question. Maybe this is for Manjula. When small farm holdings are more productive and produce more acre than large monotype farming, it seems counterintuitive that the large scale industrial farming is the more commercial. Is this a marketing issue, and how can we change this?
I think we just answered that, Ravi,
No.
minutes back about the need for collectivization and improving the bargaining capacity of the smallholders and getting that economics of scale.
Okay, fine.
Maybe if I can add a little bit here, Ravikant.
Yes, please.
Answer here is that the small scale farmer always has a problem of marketing.
Yes.
That's a major issue for them. For example, if a smallholder farmer has 1 kg or 2 kg of vegetables spare, which he or she can really sell it, but they cannot go to the market to sell this 1 kg or 2 kg of this. Whereas a big farmer who has 5 quintals or 10 quintals can really go to the market or mandi and sell it. Yes. That is a major issue, in fact. And we have examples there. For example, you see the Amul is one of the excellent examples with us.
Correct.
That is where we really need to copy it for vegetables and other perishables as well.
Yes, true. And there's one comment also that can we ever have an evergreen revolution, and will the evergreen revolution address the problem or help make the Twain between biodiversity and agriculture meet effectively?
That is the only solution for us. We must accept it if we really want to sustain.
Yeah,
evergreen revolution is an answer for us.
Yeah, and also there are a number of other questions, but I think due to a lack of time, I think we will try to answer them by email. And at this point of time, I would like to thank all our webinar speakers for giving an excellent overview of the on this topic on biodiversity and agriculture. Will the Twain ever meet? And I think I'll conclude. I would say that while intensification of agriculture is imperative to meet the growing food demands, the ecological and environmental costs of agriculture production cannot be ignored. And we have to understand that biodiversity plays a major role for sustainable intensification of food production. And biodiversity not only provides a safety net during times of distress, especially during times of drought and other natural calamities, but also provides nutritional security and diversification of livelihood opportunities, especially the economically and socially marginalized communities in India. And as Dr. Dawson said, there are high transaction costs associated with practical adoption. And biodiversity roles are context specific, and there are, of course, costs involved. And it is important that good extension systems that build knowledge are needed for wide-scale adoption. With that, I would like to conclude by mentioning that there is a need for cross-sectoral coordination of policies in the conservation domain and the agriculture sector for ensuring that biodiversity continues to provide food and nutrition security, as well as in ensuring rural livelihoods. I would like to remind you all that the next webinar in the biodiversity conservation series is also listed in the chat box, is on biodiversity and bioeconomy. So that will actually continue with what we have started today. A lot of topics are overlapping between biodiversity and agriculture, And this topic on biodiversity and bioeconomy is locating bioresource-based development pathways will be held on Friday, 16th October at the same time at 4 o'clock. And I would like to thank again all the speakers for their wonderful insights today. Thank you, Dr. Kuldeep Singh, Dr. Ann Dawson, and Dr. Manjula Menon for taking your time to present your insights on the importance of biodiversity in meeting the food and nutritional challenges. We thank all of you for attending this webinar. For further information, please write to us via email, contact@biodiversitycollaborative.org. The email is also listed in the chat box. We request all of you to follow the Biodiversity Collaborative on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So in all the social media channels, the Biodiversity Collaborative is there. Please follow the Biodiversity Collaborative. I would like to once again acknowledge the support we have received from the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India for conducting these webinars. Looking forward to meeting you all on Friday at 4 p.m. for the webinar on biodiversity and bioeconomy. Thank you, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you, Dr. Ravi.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.